Got it. Cool. So just a quick intro from me into GWL, and then I'm going to give a short perspective of my own on Greenham. So I think some of you here will know the library well, but if you're new to it, this is a big welcome from my living room, not from the library, but a big digital welcome. So as our title implies, we are a library, but we're also a museum and an archive. And we celebrate the lives and achievements of women, past and present. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been delivering more and more events online, and we've also reopened the library to visitors for our exhibition, cut books. I think the other important thing I want to say as an introduction to GWL is that it's really typical for us to work with artists, and GWL was founded by artists and is still steered by that energy and creativity. And this event came directly out of that. It's no exception to this, through working with Yvonne Billimore, who, as I said, is facilitating and presenting alongside me. So I am surely going to hand over to Yvonne, but I'm just going to switch from hosting into just a wee my own perspective on Greenham to start us off. Yeah, and we'll go from there with a number of different perspectives. So yeah, so I'd heard of, maybe not obviously, but I had heard of Greenham before joining the library, the team at GWL. But I looked at Greenham first through the eyes of Spare Rib, which is a feminist magazine that we have in our collection. We have a full run of it that was published in the 70s and 80s. So when I was looking through Spare Rib, I was looking for documents of women's protest culture in the 80s. And as I read through the pages of the magazine, Greenham kept appearing. So I guess the longevity of the protest and its iconic nature really struck me. I felt the coverage in Spare Rib was really fair. It documented the achievements, some of which I'm sure others are going to talk about, not just how long it lasted, but also the power it had to gather people. So the 50,000 women who came in terrible December conditions to reflect the base, or the 30,000 women who made the human chain around it and embraced the base. These are just sort of two of the more famous protests. So alongside these achievements, Spare Rib also documented where it fell short. So for example, it tracked elements of racism in British culture, most particularly in the police force, that made it harder for Black women to participate, and also that not all Greenham participants were able to see this at the time. It also conducted surveys of mainstream media perspectives on the protest, with a characteristically Spare Rib feminist lens. And finally, it carried out surveys on the streets, looking at why perhaps working class women might be less likely to participate in Greenham. So yeah, from Spare Rib, I was intrigued, and soon moved from the articles to our own archive of boxes that we have on Greenham and the related peace campaigning, as well as to the books we've got on the shelves. Yeah, and I think maybe just two things to say from there. The first is that what I found that really grabbed me was this sort of deep engagement with the idea of non-violence, that showed a group of women determined to track ways in which violence permeates our culture, so that we carry it around and sometimes unwittingly reproduce it in tiny ways. So whether it's in our interactions with each other, or symbolically, or through our responses to the natural world, so both on personal and social levels. So without having experienced the mud or the joy of the camp, I could still feel how this careful engagement was relevant to my everyday life. So yeah, that was, yes, non-violence was the first thing. And the second thing I saw was a real attempt at the creation of an organizational system where everyone involved was equal, and that rather than being a chaos, this approach that sort of shunned the idea of one or two iconic leaders did produce inspired acts of organization. So again, getting 50,000 people to link hands is one example. And also I think inspired acts of protest that were well ahead of their time that we could still learn from. So the organizational web, as it was often described, reached out to struggles against what we could call nuclear colonialism everywhere. And it made strong links with other places like the Marshall Islands and women came to speak out from there, and we've got really interesting records of that in our archive. As early as the 1980s, these women were already warning about the threat of global warming. And alongside this, some of the protest actions really struck me. So the die-ins that women staged on site, but also in major London hubs that were sort of disrupting to the normal flow of business and finance, still seem to be, are still used today to face the threat of climate change. So I think mainly it was important for me to, what I appreciated was that how this first kind of deep engagement with non-violence led to Greenham activists pioneering new forms of protest that were not only effective and disruptive, but I think also in many cases joyful and actually really beautiful to witness. And there are many sort of photos preserved after the events that kind of still hold that beauty, I think, in our archive, but I'm sure in many other archives too, both in institutions and informally. So yeah, I guess at that point, part of what we'd like to do today as well is reach out to people who might still have things to donate. So yeah, and I think we've got some donations already before we even opened up the Zoom, so that's great. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much me, just to really sort of say that the shared history and the sort of reach and visionary nature of Greenham was something we all remarked upon when we were researching. Particularly the Nuclear Free Pacific campaign drew our attention. And maybe just the final thing to add is that unlike a lot of women who joined the workshop, Yvonne and myself had no direct experience of Greenham, but there was this kind of shared desire to look at this amazing feminist movement through the lens of a set of feminist research methods that we could shape collectively as a group. I think that's what we've been doing. As well as bringing the sort of feminist methods to the archive, Yvonne also brought an artist's perspective, and in this way she mirrored the methods of the activists who I think really did use artistic and feminist sensibilities to reimagine protest. So that's me, I think. Maybe just to say that Kate, who's with us and was originally involved in the workshops, put us in touch with Iona and Jane, who'll be speaking as well. And in turn, Jane invited Sheila and Margaret. So that's our small web, which is part of a much bigger web of Greenham events and celebrations that, I'm going to say a little bit about at the end, as it is the 40th anniversary of the march today. So yeah, I'm just going to welcome Yvonne now, and I've given Yvonne a little bit of an introduction, but just to say that Yvonne is an artist and curator based between Scotland and Helsinki. And Yvonne, thanks so much for participating from Finland, where you're 2 hours ahead. And as I mentioned, Yvonne first encountered Greenham Common through working in archives and continues to engage with it through her project, Feminist Collective Research Practices. So yeah, over to Yvonne.
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, I'm Yvonne, and I just want to start with a very quick description of where I'm situated and my background. So I have a fair coloured skin and I have long brown hair, which is in a ponytail. I am wearing a pair of round glasses, and behind me I have a white wall with some plants and a picture on the wall that I think is back to front for everyone. It reads "For Still Possible Worlds," and there's a picture of a worm, and it's a print by Joss Allen. Okay, and then I will continue by basically I'm going to read something that I've written based on my research with other people. I also want to share some slides, which is just a compilation of documents from the archives on Greenham, mostly from Glasgow Women's Library, also the Feminist Library in London, and where else? Mayday rooms in London, and the the Women's Art Library. Yes, so there's lots of different things. But I actually sort of scrambled these together quite last minute, so unfortunately I haven't made image descriptions for accessibility, and perhaps people won't be able to read what they see, but it's just to kind of give a span of the kinds of documents that are in the archives, and some sort of notes and anecdotes and things that are also like handwritten things that go alongside it. So let's see if I can share this screen. Oh, look, there we go. Okay, can everybody see this okay? Yep, okay, I will start. So, 40 years on from the beginning of Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, what do we still have in common? How has it shaped our worlds, and what are the connections and relationships, both personal and political, that have grown out of this movement? We invite you to bring memories, anecdotes, reflections on Greenham Common, as well as the various struggles it has intersected with and that you're currently involved with. Many women, many hands, many visions. Greenham women are everywhere, and we have some here today. Hundreds of thousands of women participated directly and indirectly, some living on site long term, others for periods of time, some coming by busloads for protests or supporting from afar, some having never even visited. They are all Greenham women. Each have their own stories, experiences, and reasons for engaging. As a protest stretching over 2 decades, intersecting and linking with a whole host of movements, peace, anti-nuclear, anti-militarism, women's liberation, LGBTQ rights, anti-racism movements, anti-colonialism in the Pacific, miners' strikes, anti-uranium extraction in Africa, prison abolitionism, anti-capitalism, and nuclear families, and many, many more. There is no single story of Greenham Common, and its narrative is not linear. Despite growing up on the River Clyde, directly across the water from Faslane, a naval base that is now the home of all of Britain's nuclear weapons, I was actually completely oblivious to my immediate proximity to nuclear weapons and the permanent peace camp that was sited there since 1982. Actually, often I imagine that it was purposely kept from me, a plot conspired by my mother and granddad, perhaps, to stop me running away to join the unruly peace protesters. Let's just say my feminist and ecological politics were not welcomed at the dinner table or in any other room for that matter. But more likely, and certainly more concerning, is that the threats and violence of nuclear weapons, close or far, did not occupy the consciousness of many people living in the area. Nothing to be concerned about, they keep us safe. And so it was not until my 30s and with the horror of my own ignorance that I started to pay attention to nuclear matters. I stumbled across Greenham Common in an archive. It was during a period of archival research in the Women's Art Library and the Mayday rooms in London, where I was searching, and I mean searching, for materials on ecofeminism. As someone without any direct experience of the movement, I often ask, who am I to tell stories and complicate narratives of Greenham Common? But it is precisely the unruly, polyvocal and complex entanglements of Greenham and its archives which draw me to the movement, and that I feel many more of us can further contribute to. The archives, as you can see in these slides, are bursting with materials on multiple intersecting movements. They are a contact site for intersectional struggles and an incredible place for drawing relationships between struggles, past, present, and future. Greenham Common scrambles time and space. For me, Greenham archives have also been a place to explore feminist collective research, a thread of my practice which seeks to find ways to research with and alongside each other, based on feminist principles of interdependence and mutual support. As Caroline mentioned, in 2019, I ran a 2-day study group at Glasgow Women's Library called Rereading Greenham Common. And the most amazing group of participants joined, and some of them are part of this working group. And I'm also delighted that some are here in this Zoom today. So yes, during the workshop, we worked together directly with the materiality of the archive, cross-referencing and intersecting our research with our own work and interests, as well as the other participants in the group. We wanted to consider how we could all add to Greenham's polyvocal history and bring in our own experiences, knowledges, and even speculations to create new links or widen the web of activism, past, present, and future. And I'm going to end with a poem that combines some fragments from Greenham archives with writing that's been formed through thinking with others in the Greenham archives. Okay. I think I still have a bit of time to read this. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Singing ocean of women encircle the base. Greenham, December 12th, 1982. Many women, many voices, many hands, many visions. The nuclear issue could sometimes become a bi-issue. In a fight against nuclear families and ambitions to learn how to be a lesbian, to re-energize, to escape from a patriarchal society, to find shelter in a women-only peace camp, made and remade. Different gates, different struggles. Yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, red, orange, turquoise, and emerald. Comrades in anti-arms. Negotiating strange political bedfellows. When is difference welcomed, and when is difference too much? Perhaps justice might look different. When is commoning required? To make the connections between bi-issues, between leaky bodies, and increasingly fragile systems of interdependence, collapsing under the common myth of the isolated, unporous, self-sustaining individual. Individualism must diffuse, making links, creating chains, weaving the web, as a move to decolonize ecofeminism? Why haven't you known Titiwea Harawia challenged the people of Britain in 1985? Why haven't you known about jellyfish babies? Why haven't you known about the effects of alien, colonial, political, and military domination of the Indigenous people? About uranium mining and nuclear dumping? Of slow violences permeating through extraction, mining, flaring, fracking, oil leaks, irradiated coconuts. Cactus's cloud explosion reached as high as 90,000 feet. Koa's blast was 3.7 megatons, radiating new relationalities across transmorgifying oceans. Magnolia predicted fallout. Okay, that's me.
Thanks so much for that, Yvonne. That's powerful stuff. Clapping, silent clapping. So yeah, I'm happy to welcome Kate, following on from Yvonne. So as I mentioned, Kate Kelly was original participant in the workshops. Kate lives in Glasgow. She's a member of the Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace Education Scotland, Amnesty International, and Campaign Against the Arms Trade. She's currently exploring the root causes of why, at both an individual and a collective level, humanity continues to cling to having nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and on the basis that they keep us safe. She's asking the question, how might this play out in the experience of masculine and feminine energies? She's not looking at this in terms of gender, and stresses that regardless of their gender, everyone has 4 qualities: wounded masculine, wounded feminism, healthy masculine, healthy feminism. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Kate. Now, if you're ready, Kate.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Caroline. Good evening and a warm welcome from Glasgow. I'm Kate Kelly and a member of Peace Education Scotland, who work to encourage peace through education about nuclear weapons. Just before the first lockdown, I attended the event curated and conceived by Yvonne, Rereading Greenham Common Peace Camp. The Women's Library held the archive and hosted the event. So this year is the 40th anniversary of Greenham, and when Peace Education decided to celebrate this, I contacted Caroline from the library and Yvonne for inspiration. And from this, our Greenham thread came together, and we were joined by Jane Tallants and Iona Soper. One thread took us back to the archive, where we discovered that women at Greenham, including Zoe Ishtar and Bridget Roberts, came together as women working for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific, which became part of the international network to support the Indigenous grassroots movement, Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific, which began formally in Fiji in 1975. Links were developed with women from the Pacific, human rights and environmental groups, churches, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, political groups, and the conversation between them all contributed to the Pacific Women's Tour of the UK being organised. And many Indigenous women from the Pacific came to the UK and told their stories of the shocking legacy for them and their communities of living through nuclear colonialism. Risks from global warming were also mentioned, in particular that 300,000 islanders from Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands were considered at risk of being forced to abandon their homes as sea levels rise. One of the women who was part of the speaking tour was the late Lejeong Ekalan from the Marshall Islands. Lejeong visited Glasgow, and she spoke in St Stephen's Church in Bath Street. Her words are remembered by Brian Cale, a cherished elder of the Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Lejeune also visited the anti-nuclear Faslane Peace Camp, as remembered by Jane Tallants. Faslane Peace Camp continues to provide a focus for active resistance to the nuclear warheads, only 30 miles from Glasgow. I first visited Greenham with a bunch of women from Aberdeen on a day trip, and I returned on my own in 1986. Turned up at the camp with a borrowed sleeping bag and no idea whatsoever where I might sleep that night. I was offered refuge in a bender. I stayed for 3 days and I have many memories. Leaving the camp and walking into the cover of darkness with Jane from Leeds, who visited the camp most weekends with her bolt cutters. Jane needed assistance and balanced on my shoulders to cut sections of the fence. I watched in awe as it went down. This memory has recently surfaced. I witnessed a woman in long flowing robes, chanting and making contact with the earth with a staff she was carrying. Like my 36-year-old self had no idea what was going on. My 71-year-old self recognized that this woman was probably a shaman, and through her ritual was protecting the land and the women. Today, the cruise missiles are long gone, and Greenham Common is a place of peace. But many, many people have carried the thread of the energy from Greenham out into the world and continued to protest against the continued existence of nuclear weapons. Today, a patriarchal system continues to support nuclear production and ignores the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty passed by the United Nations in 2017 to completely ban the use and production of nuclear weapons. When I listened to Setsuko Thurlow, a Hiroshima survivor, declare at the United Nations that nuclear weapons have always been a model, now they are also illegal, a tingle went down my spine. The thread of the energy from Greenham had travelled all the way to the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That's really lovely. Thanks for reading. So next, next in our group, we've got Iona, and Kate very kindly introduced me and the group to Iona. And brought us all together really. Iona Soper is an anti-capitalist and anti-nuclear activist based in Glasgow as well. She began her journey through Greenham's legacy as an academic and resident campaigner at Faslane Peace Camp, and has gone on to develop work and campaigns for Scottish CND, Peace Education Scotland and Secure Scotland. She's a proud member of Solidarity Against Neoliberal Extremism and IQAN, International Quiz Against Nukes. Welcome, Iona.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I hope everyone can hear me all right. And yeah, just what amazing contributions we've had so far. Slightly similarly to Yvonne, I'm going to chat for 7 to 8 minutes and then share a poem. So yeah, I mean, without further ado, my first understanding of Greenham came in 2015. I was an anthropology student at the University of Edinburgh, and I had chosen for my dissertation to study the relationships between the residents at the Faslane Peace Camp, which, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, Lord help me, what was I thinking? But it was my friend's father who, on kind of talking about this, had said to me, yeah, that's the women's camp. And this was someone who had lived most of their life in Scotland, never having heard of the Faslane Peace Camp, but who had clearly at some point been touched by news of Greenham Common. So I think for me, the legacy of Greenham is it's tied up in kind of two main strands. The first being the occupation of space and the kind of organic growth of alternative forms of organization and practice. And the second one being the feminization of challenging power. And of course, these two things interweave, and I will come to them in turn, just because I'm not a mind map. So my major connection to Greenham is obviously through the Peace Camp at Faslane, whose history from year one has been entwined with that of Greenham. The two camps were established within a year of one another, and they have shared common cause, resources, and of course lots of residents ever since. During my research at Faslane for my dissertation, and later after realizing that I was a much better peace camper than I was an anthropologist and returning as a resident, I would be joined, or we would all be joined at meetings and vigils by activists from Trident Ploughshares and Nuke Watch and CND groups, many of whom were former peace campers at either Faslane or Greenham or both. And I think as a sort of new generation of activists coming up through this huge legacy of the anti-war movement that was set by the generation before, we, or certainly I, am definitely guilty of kind of rather desperately seeking validation of all of my efforts from people who were around and active during those kind of glory days. And it's always been of immense comfort to me to speak with Jane Tallants and others, have a bit of a moan about a conflict or an internal struggle that we were going through at the camp, and just be met with solidarity and reassured that the space has survived through the exact same struggles, 10 times over in the course of its history. I regret that I don't know enough about other peace camps that were popping up at that time, including, I know there was a women's peace camp on a roundabout in Versailles. Maybe somebody here can enlighten me when we get to chatting. But certainly in the case of Faslane and Greenham, these camps, really managed to survive the test of time, to grow, to expand, to organize. And in doing this, they both really transcended this role of just being a base from which to take direct action. And, whether you like it or not, you've kind of become an organic model for practicing alternative means of sustaining yourselves and organizing yourselves and protecting yourselves. And, that's not to say that we always get it right, because as I'm sure everyone here knows, we absolutely don't. But going through these processes, the hours spent on consensus and residency procedures, the examining power dynamics and conflict resolution under a microscope, learning from our mistakes and often learning from repeating our mistakes, this really allows us to build and also to demonstrate an understanding of what real human security is, of what actually makes people feel safe, what actually keeps communities together. And, that for me is one of our strongest tools as a movement. So there's a bit of a sad irony in that the occupation of land that allows this to happen is frequently the same tool that is used by those who support nuclear weapons to completely delegitimize the movement. And I think there's even a subconscious delegitimization, even when you're speaking with people who aren't necessarily opposed to anti-nuclear protesters. I get it, particularly whenever I speak to the press, the issue is always framed as, you've given up your life in mainstream society to pursue this cause. It's always, bizarrely romanticized, but also framed as this great loss or this sacrifice. And it really focuses on looking backwards on what you were leaving behind, and not on embracing an opportunity to be a part of something that could potentially be transformative. But such is, the kind of public perception of the peace camper, and an intrinsic part of fighting nuclear weapons is that there are huge stakes at risk. Those who support nuclear weapons will use every tool in their arsenal to seek to delegitimize our viewpoints. And so part of our struggle has always been this task of seeking legitimacy under that system in the interests of kind of driving forward immediate change through those mainstream avenues. But it's also been very important for us to critique and challenge the overarching system that just immediately denies legitimacy to a voice for peace, and has been well documented by many people far better at speaking and writing than I am. That system is intrinsically gendered. The dominant narrative surrounding security has been shaped and formed by dangerous masculinities, right down to the language used to describe nuclear weapons and the people who oppose them. And so if we are to expect just positive outcomes from our struggle against nuclear weapons, in which disarmament is not treated as an opportunity to invest in new forms of weaponry and destruction, we must understand these weapons and this struggle in the context of a patriarchal system in which the virtues of strength, courage, protection, and security are inseparable from acts of violence. Which brings me to the sort of second huge part of Greenham's legacy for me, which is this feminization of challenging power, which again, it manifests in so many different ways. I'm going to take the opportunity straight away just to plug Ray Atchison's book, Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, which tells the story of the journey to implementing the United Nations nuclear ban treaty, and is, at least for me, essentially the sort of feminist anti-nuclear Bible for the modern age. One of the things that Ray breaks down really well is exactly how these gendered narratives of security are built, how they are perpetuated, and how our challenge of that power needs to recognize how this way of thinking has infected almost every aspect of our lives. And it must contain the antidote to that way of thinking, which is an inclusive, organic, feminist perspective. And spaces like Greenham and Faslane have always provided space for a culture of challenging gender stereotypes, from the smallest acts to the most personal and the most meaningful, whether it's women gaining new practical skills, organizing and taking direct action, or working with tools they might not have otherwise. I recently attended a workshop of Slaghammer. It's a feminist welding collective that former campers have been involved with. Or just when we think about activities that women have traditionally been excluded from, I think we can't underestimate the value of spaces like this in normalizing women's voices and women's actions in political conversations, leadership role, decision-making, both to the rest of the world, but also crucially in our own mindsets and our own understandings of ourselves. For much of my time there, I lived among close friends for whom the camp was the place that they came to feel safe, to explore or be open about elements of their sexuality or their gender identity. And let's be honest, living off-grid often attracts people who are accustomed to feeling othered. And so having these spaces of safety and real solidarity has been vital for the mental well-being of many of our residents, who have the space to understand and challenge all that internalized shame, homophobia, self-doubt. Watching people blossom in this way, exploring elements of my own identity and how they relate to the world's perception of me, has been absolutely vital to developing my understanding of patriarchy and the mental damage it brings us from birth, and also in building my confidence to get out in the world and take a stand. So to try and wrap up with something slightly more positive, I think the defining lesson I've learned through this journey of thinking about Greenham and thinking about the legacy is that this campaign can never be static. We can't ever allow it to stand still or represent a fixed point in time. And the fact that we're all here today to celebrate all of the generations and all the iterations of Greenham's legacy is just testament to the fact that we're not going to let that happen. We have to be constantly searching for new perspectives, new allies, new solutions. We constantly have to be updating and critiquing our own understandings of strength and security. We must keep the campaign moving forward, ensuring that no one is left behind. And we must be relentless in our pursuit of true peace and freedom. Nuclear weapons are ever evolving, and so must we. So I'm going to finish with a quick poem I wrote for this event, which is called Greenham in Common. My sister lives in the shadow of evil. She wields wooden weapons and weeps well-watered tears. She's communed, camped, campaigned for a righteous upheaval. She's had thousands of faces the last 40 years. She's brought life to this land of war, walls, and barbed wire, tired of being somebody's wife, somebody's daughter. She's grown tired of watching as fire fights fire. There's no room in that story for water. My sister dreams of a world free from violence. She will overcome. Peace is vital to strive for. Echoes of songs, endless minutes of silence. Her hands on the fence, her heart with survivors. Her arms reach out wide to extend solidarity, to cherish, to shelter, to turn foes into friends. Their arms extend as far as their vanity, a deception of destruction disguised as defense. My sister fights for true human security, raises up those beaten down for their difference. She fights against plots to take lives with impunity. She fights for an end to the myth of deterrence. This industry of villainy is always cloaked in secrecy. Secret cameras in the canopies, a secret stranger with a stolen name. The censorship designed to hide the lasting legacy of secret conversations, secret innovations, secret tests, secret death counts, secret shame. My sister knows how to speak truth to power. She knows what it means to pledge never again. She could transform our lives if this life would allow her. Now she sings with the voice of a global campaign. Her life and her legacy will not be forgotten. When we take our stand, we do not stand alone, because she and we have Greenham in common, and through Greenham, we are carried home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. That was really lovely. Yeah, appreciate that honesty as well, and the depth of description about your own experiences of Fastlane too. And I think, yeah, I just said it a little bit, but also, yeah, it not being a sacrifice but a joy in some ways, you know, to be part of that. So, yeah, thanks. I've realised that I've gone against my own schedule, and I need to go back one step to invite Jane Talons to speak. So yeah, again, Kate invited Jane to join our group, and Jane visited Greenham a number of times in the 80s, and was inspired and empowered to get involved in taking action for a nuclear-free world, and has been doing so continuously ever since, as the banner shows. Still doing so now as well. So after living at Fastlane Peace Camp until 1990, she has an active role in organising non-violent direct action with Trident Ploughshares and Fastlane 365, and tracking nuclear warhead convoys on our roads with Nuke Watch. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody that's spoken so far. It's and especially these beautiful poems. There's so much I could think of to say for this workshop, and all the ideas there have set me off with hours and hours more of thinking to do. And the last few days when I've been going for walks, just thinking what I was going to say, it's amazing because this dewy weather has highlighted all the spiders' webs all the way along the fence and in the fields around us, and so much reminds me of that, the web image from Greenham of how we all connect together, and we certainly do across continents but also across generations here, because there's things echoed in what we all say through these different generations. Anyway, I first visited Greenham in 1982 for 2 weeks. I arrived there thinking, wow, these women, they're just so amazing, they're so strong and they're so fearless. And after 2 weeks there, I left feeling, no, we women are amazing and strong and fearless, and empowerment was just through me. I've visited again many times, and there are so many stories you can tell about Greenham, about the actions, about breaking into the base, blocking the gates, pulling down the gates and cutting fences, about the living on the common and connecting with its beauty and surviving in all the different weathers, and also through daily evictions from Newbury Council, who came along and stole the women's stuff regularly, about internal politics and political battles with, let's face it, a pretty patriarchal mainstream peace movement. And there are as many stories as there are Greenham women. But for me, what was the most vital thing about Greenham was how it reached out to empower women to not only resist nuclear weapons at Greenham and elsewhere, but to claim space in many political and campaigning movements and often create our own spaces where things could be done differently. So Greenham women are everywhere, and carry Greenham home were not just slogans, they happened. The actual model of claiming physical space outside a nuclear installation inspired many peace camps to be set up across the UK and beyond to Europe, the USA, Australia. I think there are over 30 peace camps in the UK at different points. Some like Greenham were women only, others were mixed, but they were all autonomous and all had their very own sort of identity and way of doing things. After visiting Greenham, I went to a newly set up peace camp at Brambles Farm near Portsmouth, where I clocked up my very first arrest, sitting in front of a huge bulldozer as construction began for a Marconi factory to make torpedoes, which were going to be potentially nuclear armed. But actually, I remember an incident the day before my arrest more clearly. I stood up and I addressed everybody on the top deck of the bus I was on and invited them to come down to the camp and support us. And I was absolutely terrified of public speaking, but I discovered at that point suddenly the need to tell people about the threat of nuclear war was far more urgent than the knocking of my knees. And actually, that day I found my voice and started to speak out. That first experience of being arrested and locked up was really liberating, strangely, for someone, acknowledgedly, someone as privileged like me, in this time and this place, confronting the status quo by taking direct action that leads to arrest, even on occasion prison, isn't that much of an ordeal. And I believe that non-violent direct action is a really important tactic, and somewhere along the line, it may lead to being locked up. After a brief spell at Lossiemouth Peace Camp, way up north, I joined with some people from various other camps to organise the Walk for Life, which was an 11-week peace walk from Faslane down to Greenham. And it's kind of like a peace camp on the move, and it swelled to 200 participants by the time we reached our destination. And eventually I landed at Faslane Peace Camp in 1984, and I stayed there for 6 years, had my 2 kids there, and I've continued to live in Scotland and campaign against nuclear weapons here ever since then. So even though I'd always known that I strongly opposed using military force and I thought nuclear weapons were barbaric, it was the anarchic horizontal way of working together at Greenham and other camps that drew me in, as Iona has spoken a bit about. For me, again, working by consensus without leaders is a much better way to include people and make decisions that everyone can get behind, rather than adversarial kind of top-down models. And you're right, it's not always easy. At Faslane, when I lived there, we had many meetings that went for hours and hours as we grapple with the complexities of kind of living in a community and dealing with the people across the road with the nuclear bombs. Washing up was very regularly on the agenda. I'll also admit I was a vice chair of Scottish CND for a number of years in the 1990s, but I certainly wore that title very lightly. When the American cruise missiles were eventually based at Greenham, there were regular exercises as the convoys of nuclear missile launchers went out onto Salisbury Plain. The idea was that they could hide in a secret location and not be wiped out by Russian missiles before they had time to launch their deadly load. Greenham women were a vital part of Cruise Watch, and as a cruise convoy prepared to leave, The phone trees were activated, and a great network of watchers spread out to all the junctions to track its progress and make sure that its secret destination was definitely not secret. Sometimes they shone big spotlights on it, and they kind of said, hey, it's here, no secret. So remember, this was during the time of no internet, not even mobile phones. This all happened. CB radios were kind of the tool of the day. And as cruisers eventually withdrawn from Greenham, a similar network was set up to track movements of the nuclear weapons here in the UK, coming up and down the road from Burfield up to Coalport, which is just over the hill from Fastlane. So I've been keeping track of these nuclear convoys for 37 years with Newport. The technology's moved on both for them and for us. We now have, mobile phones, lots of internet, lots of ways of communicating, and we try and keep track of each convoy that comes. I've also stood from time to time right in front of these convoys, because it's the only opportunity really you get to get in the way of the UK's nuclear weapons and say, right, if you want to carry on with your deadly load, okay, but you have to move me out the way first. Of course, they do move me, and along with many other people over the years, I've been taken to court and even to prison for doing what I can to get in their way. Another strategy used by Greenham Women was to get the word out about nuclear weapons by reaching out beyond the peace movement into the lives of ordinary women who weren't politically active. So from Women's Hour to the Women's Institute, from the Women's Own to knitting circles, Greenham Women tirelessly wrote and spoke and travelled to meetings. And the messages were passed on from woman to woman, so that the 10,000 they needed to link arms around the 7-mile base at Greenham for embracing the base turned into this 30,000 women who turned up on the day. I think it was just such a wild idea. We couldn't bear it not to succeed. So everybody went, and they took every woman they could drag there. We had a similar strategy in 2006 when we organised Fastlane 365, which is a year of blockading of Fastlane. We reached way out beyond the usual suspects. Different groups came for a 2-day slot on the rota. We were in touch with religious, political, geographical, many other diverse groups to disrupt business as usual at the base in whatever way they could think of. Our little core group often didn't know what was coming next, so the police had absolutely no chance of knowing. From locking themselves to every kind of cleverly disguised object, from teddy bears to tea urns, covering themselves in red paint, using every excuse to get into that road. We even deployed the Bishop of Reading, complete with staff and mitre at one point. The base was disrupted day after day, and often by lots of people who had never taken such action before. Greenham Women also knew it was never just about that particular weapon or that particular base in rural Berkshire, and they made the links that only with potential catastrophe everyone on the planet faced if there was major nuclear exchange, but how people were already suffering as a consequence. At Fastlane Peace Camp, we made the links between the warheads being deployed and those affected by the radiation, where the uranium is mined, such as Namibia, and also victims of nuclear testing, such as Australia, Soviet Union, and has already been mentioned by others, the women from the Pacific. This banner behind me, I dragged out of my cupboard because I'm a real hoarder. I made this banner back in the 80s when Lee Jean and the others came to visit us and gave their powerful testimony to us at the camp, and just make a complete lie of the nuclear apologist myth that nuclear weapons keep the peace. For lots of people, they really don't. In Trident Ploughshares, we also made those connections, and I see Extinction Rebellion making them today as a very essential theme in the climate crisis protests. The struggle against the twin existential threats of nuclear war and climate crisis are all about recognising that we all share this earth together. For me personally, the most important thing I learnt at Greenham and have carried with me since is that you don't need to be an expert to know something's wrong. I'm truly terrible at remembering numbers, and whenever I have to talk about nuclear weapons, I have to go back again and look up the numbers of missiles and warheads and things like that. Because for me, one nuclear warhead is one too many. So I'm really glad there are people in our movement who do know those things and who know about the treaties and the policies and the cost of it all and things like that. But I also value those who can drive or make a banner or make some soup. or basically are just willing to come along and plonk themselves down in a road and call a halt, however briefly, to the insanity of having the end of the world at our fingertips still. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I started to feel like I've missed an opportunity to be standing in front of a very big lorry with you, so I'm going to chat to you about doing that afterwards. I'm like, what am I doing? And yeah, thanks for bringing the banner. Gives me a chance to do a shout out in case anyone that we've got here today has materials that they want to put in an archive to join the other Greenham stuff. So thanks for that. Right. So also Jane has introduced us to Margaret and Sheila, who got up next. So sharing a screen there, and I think it's Sheila and Margaret, actually, that it should be the other way.
Margaret and Sheila.
Right, sorry. Sheila Mackay and Margaret Bremner. So Sheila joined Glasgow West CND in the early 1980s, attended a training in non-violent direct action and joined the Gaelic Horticulturalists. Am I saying that right? Gaelic, yeah. NVDA group, which is a non-violent direct action, and trained as an NVDA trainer. With the Gaelic Horts, she visited Greenham 2 or 3 times to camp for the weekend. The Gaelic Horts have been her main affinity group for nearly 40 years. With the Horts, she joined actions with Trident Ploughshares, CAT, and others sometimes. She worked at the Scottish Centre for Non-Violence for 2 years in 2000. Other areas of campaigning have been against violence against women, Palestine solidarity, and anti-racism. So that's great, and that's a very impressive list. and to join Sheila, we've got Margaret Bremner. So Margaret helped deliver NVDA training at Glasgow Women's Centre in preparation for going on some weekend trips to Greenham in the early 80s. She continues to work against nuclear weapons as part of the Gaelic Horts affinity group and to sing Greenham songs on demonstrations. She is active in Palestinian solidarity and still trying to dismantle the arms industry and patriarchy, which we know is a long-term aspiration. So welcome.
Thanks very much. We're going to keep it very short because so much has been said, and it's been absolutely brilliant listening to these presentations. We've so enjoyed them. They've been absolutely great, moving and thought-provoking as well. We've brought along, is it 5 pictures and a couple of songs?
Yeah, sorry, I need to get that up. Bear with me 2 seconds.
So when we're just going to sing a couple of verses from a couple of songs that we brought back from Greenham, and hopefully they'll be really familiar to a lot of people who are on this Zoom. This first picture is our first visit, I think, to Greenham with the Horts. Margaret's poking her head out of the tent in the top picture. And were we at Redgate? We're at Redgate. We fell in love there, so it does mean quite a lot to us. And the song we're going to sing for this slide is Under the Full Moonlight.
Yeah. If you want to join in, please mute yourself. Unfortunately, that feels very anti-Greenham to say that, but the sound just doesn't work. So here we go. Under the full moonlight we dance, spirits dance, we dance, joining hands we dance, joining souls rejoice. Under the full moonlight we dance, spirits dance, we dance, joining hands we dance, joining souls rejoice. We'll zoom on to the next picture, if you can do that for us, thanks. And just as people have said already, part of the whole struggle is making the links, and this huge, beautiful banner that we had up at at the Red Gate was basically at the point then just talking about the huge mountains that the EEC was building, and we're still trying to make these links even as we go on today. We'll jump on to the third slide if that's okay.
Thanks, Caroline. The Horts drew a lot of inspiration from Greenham's creative protests, decorating fences, beautiful banners, dancing and singing, weaving webs. And this action was inspired by grandmothers in our group who felt that their message was very powerful, trying to create a world safe for their grandchildren.
You can actually see that's the back of Jane with the berry and the stripy jumper and her pigtail hanging down. And there's quite a few of our group and other women who came out in the snow to demonstrate at the gates at Fastlane. And the song that is surely anthemic from Greenham and that we were singing as we spiraled around, weaving in and out, which was often a brilliant way to blockade a gate, was "You Can't Kill the Spirit," so sing along. You can't kill the spirit, she is like a mountain, old and strong, she goes on and on and on. You can't kill the spirit, she is like a mountain, old and strong. She goes on and on and on. You can't kill the spirit, she is like a mountain, old and strong. She goes on and on and on.
And you could sing that for a very long time. The spirit does go on and on, as people have said, and in our Horties we certainly have found our Girdle Horticulturalist Non-Violent Direct Action Group, which we nowadays call the Horties, absolutely key things in sustaining our group for the last 40 years have been the creativity, but also the joy and nurturing each other, eating together, sharing all different aspects of our lives. Otherwise, I don't think we would have been going for 40 years. Shall we move on?
Move on to the next slide. I'm sure Jane will remember this when we had our horrors to face in Scotland, and this was when they were making the new military road over to Coalport to house the nuclear warheads for Trident, and we had a massive Reclaim the Hills action that weekend with loads of people joining, and we dug a little peace garden up on the hillside. And I think that several people have talked about the whole thing about occupying space, occupying the land, and that kind of prompted us to sing one of the other songs that we learned at Greenham, but I think also maybe was sung often at Molesworth, and which we have sung in Palestine with the Palestinian Solidarity group as well. So we'll give it a go. They say this land is out of bounds. Our lives and our futures are out of our hands. This land is not yours to put boundaries around. We'll grow, we'll get stronger, our voices resound. And that is incredibly powerful to sing when you're standing there being told to move along. So keep holding on to these words. It's really powerful. Do you want that answered just now? We came to be known as the horticulturalists by cutting through the fence, first of all at
Glen Douglas.
Glen Douglas, and planting
A peace rose.
there.
And one of the police who arrested us said, "Oh, you're a right lot of gardeners, aren't you?"
So yeah, it's reclaiming the land for peaceful purposes, and that's continued till this day. And then we'd like to pop onto the last picture. Thanks. This is us celebrating our, I think it was our 24th anniversary or something like that. We know how to have fun. So joining in with one of the big scrap trident blockades at Fast Lane, and just using the 29th, thank you Lily, 29th anniversary. Oh yeah, the 30th was at the Dicey in London, yeah. So just to say that I think we've learned such a lot from Greenham. I think when Yvonne spoke about using the phrase leaky and porous, and one of the songs I learned at Greenham that made me laugh and cry, you can forbid nearly everything, you can't forbid me to think, you can't forbid my menstrual flow, and you can't shut my mouth when I sing. And I just think there is something about being embodied when we are doing these demonstrations. We are believing that change is possible, and we are reaching to the human in the people round about us. And so we're going to stop there, I think, because there's really room for so many other people who are in the chat room to join in. But thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting us.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for singing as well. We can imagine, yeah, a Greenham event without singing didn't seem right. That was really beautiful. So yeah, I think that is we're at the point where we shared all of our presentations. So I can open it up to everyone, people in the audience who might have questions. Might have put them in the chat already.
I think Angela wanted to share something. Is that right, Angela? Are you able
Yes,
to
I'm here.
yourself? Yeah.
So my name is Angela, and I'm originally from Germany. And when I heard about this event from Caroline earlier this year, I had a quick look at what do I know about Greenham. I had visited Greenham in, I can't remember, about 20 years ago, when there was only a small permanent presence there. We were on holiday for 4 friends, myself, and we were so warmly welcomed there. The connection that I found when I looked into it a few months ago was with the Frauenwiderstandskampf in Hunsrück in Germany. So that was a place that Wikipedia told me was modelled on Greenham Common. I used to go there like several summers in my 20s, and I had no idea it was modelled on Greenham. I think we all thought about Greenham as our sisters in England. I realised when you were singing just then that actually, God, I knew all of those songs. We used to sing all of those songs, and I can't believe I remember all the words. It's so, this singing business is so powerful. I also remembered that I started my own peace movement when I was 14, and I was gonna do confirmation in the Protestant church in our little town. And the pastor, who was very kind of left-wing radical, asked me to do a presentation about nuclear power. And I did this full of numbers, this whole thing about how many times over the nuclear weapons could kill the earth over and over. And I think my role was always, even though I went to these kind of demonstrations and things, I always kept away from anything that was illegal, because I knew that I was going to get into real trouble if I was ever arrested, because my family were very, very anti everything that I wanted to do. A bit like what Yvonne was saying, why my views were not welcome in any part of that house. So my role was always writing, singing, and arguing with people. We used to do stalls in the local town on a Saturday morning. There was a pedestrianised zone. We would have stalls. So I was involved with Amnesty International and the peace movement and things. And we would just stand there with our hand-copied leaflets and just start arguing with people about, I don't know, the death penalty and the cruise missiles and anything. And we'd always end with a kind of like a little sit-in singing protest songs. Those were usually kind of, the kind of 60s, 70s American protest songs. But I sort of, looking back, I recognize the power of those things and the positive power that it gave me. And one very funny place where I recognized these things recently, I lived in Blackpool until July, and we had obviously the fracking there, and the anti-fracking movement, that was on my doorstep, and we would do similar things. Like, I wouldn't be there because you could be arrested if you were there, and I'm a foreigner and God knows what's going to happen, but I would always honk my horn driving past there and try to sort of support people, I don't know, on Facebook, wherever. So I'm this kind of coward in the back with all the theory. So anybody wants to know theory about stuff, I've got all of that. But I suppose it needs people like me too, not just you brilliant people who go and cut down fences. So I just, yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Angela. Yeah, I think we certainly need all different skills, and when we were pulling this together, we realised we all had really different things to contribute. So about valuing all those different things, I think Jane said as well. So I just remembered that I need to ask Laura if you're able to stop the recording at this point, and then